Welcome to History Explained, where we illuminate the past to better understand our present. I'm your guide to your daily journey through the past to empower the future. Today is Friday, June 6, 2025. As we do every Friday, we're exploring a significant economic milestone that fundamentally shaped the development of our modern financial world. Today, we turn our attention to the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, a gathering that created the international monetary system that would govern global finance for the next 3 decades and establish institutions that continue to influence the world economy today. Officially known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, this meeting brought together representatives from 44 allied nations to design a new framework for international economic cooperation in the post-war world. What makes the Bretton Woods Conference particularly significant is how it represented a conscious effort to learn from the economic disasters of the interwar period and create a stable foundation for global prosperity. The architects of Bretton Woods sought to prevent the competitive devaluations, trade wars, and financial instability that had contributed to the Great Depression and ultimately to World War II itself. So let's explore this pivotal moment in economic history, examining the circumstances that led to the conference, the competing visions for post-war finance, the compromises that shaped the final agreements, and the lasting impact of the Bretton Woods system on global economics. To understand the significance of Bretton Woods, we must first examine the economic chaos that preceded it. The interwar period from 1918 to 1939 was marked by financial instability, competitive currency devaluations, and the collapse of international trade that deepened and prolonged the Great Depression. The gold standard, which had provided relative monetary stability before World War I, never fully recovered from the war's disruptions. Countries abandoned and returned to gold convertibility multiple times, creating uncertainty and speculation in foreign exchange markets. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, nations increasingly turned to protectionist policies and competitive devaluations in desperate attempts to boost their own economies at the expense of their neighbors. This "beggar thy neighbor" approach to economic policy proved disastrous for international trade and cooperation. Global trade volume fell by approximately 25% between 1929 and 1933, while unemployment soared in most industrialized nations. The economic nationalism of the 1930s contributed to political tensions that ultimately led to World War II. By 1943, as Allied victory in World War II became increasingly likely, policymakers in the United States and Britain began planning for post-war economic reconstruction. They recognized that preventing another global economic collapse required international cooperation and institutions capable of managing the complexities of modern finance and trade. The intellectual groundwork for Bretton Woods was laid by 2 brilliant economists representing very different approaches to international monetary relations: Harry Dexter White of the United States Treasury and John Maynard Keynes of the British Treasury. Both men understood the need for a new international monetary system, but they had fundamentally different visions of what that system should look like. Harry Dexter White represented the American perspective, which emphasized the dollar's emerging role as the world's dominant currency and sought to create institutions that would support free trade and currency convertibility. White's plan envisioned a stabilization fund that would help countries maintain fixed exchange rates while preventing the competitive devaluations that had plagued the 1930s. John Maynard Keynes, already famous for his revolutionary economic theories, proposed a more ambitious scheme centered on an international clearing union and a new international currency called Bancor. Keynes's vision would have created a truly supranational monetary system that could expand and contract global liquidity based on world economic conditions rather than the policies of any single nation. The fundamental tension between these approaches reflected broader questions about sovereignty, democracy, and economic management that continue to influence international economic relations today. White's plan emphasized national currencies and existing power structures, while Keynes's proposal sought to create genuinely international institutions with independent authority over global monetary conditions. The Bretton Woods Conference convened from July 1 to 22, 1944, at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The choice of location was both practical and symbolic. The resort was large enough to accommodate hundreds of delegates while being isolated enough to allow for intensive negotiations without outside distractions. The conference brought together an extraordinary collection of economic talent from around the world. In addition to White and Keynes, Delegates included future Nobel Prize winners, central bank governors, finance ministers, and academic economists who would shape post-war economic policy for decades. The negotiations were intense and sometimes acrimonious, reflecting both the technical complexity of international monetary arrangements and the underlying power dynamics between nations. The United States, as the world's dominant economic power and the host of the conference, held significant advantages in the negotiations, while Britain, despite its intellectual contributions through Keynes, was economically weakened by the war. The fundamental structure that emerged from Bretton Woods was a compromise between American and British visions, though one that tilted heavily toward the American approach. The new system established the US dollar as the central reserve currency, convertible to gold at $35 per ounce, while other currencies would maintain fixed exchange rates relative to the dollar. This gold-dollar standard meant that the dollar effectively replaced gold as the primary medium of international exchange, while the United States committed to maintaining gold convertibility at a fixed price. Other countries could adjust their exchange rates only in cases of fundamental disequilibrium, and only with the approval of the new International Monetary Fund. The conference created three major institutions that would play central roles in post-war international economics. The International Monetary Fund was designed to provide short-term financial assistance to countries experiencing balance of payments difficulties, helping them maintain their fixed exchange rates without resorting to trade restrictions or competitive devaluations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, was established to provide long-term financing for post-war reconstruction and development projects. Initially focused on rebuilding war-torn Europe, the World Bank would later shift its emphasis to promoting economic development in emerging nations. The third institution, the International Trade Organization, was intended to govern international trade relations and prevent the return of the protectionist policies that had characterized the 1930s. However, the ITO was never ratified by the U.S. Congress, and its functions were eventually assumed by the less comprehensive General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. The Bretton Woods system represented several important innovations in international economic cooperation. It established the principle that exchange rates should be managed cooperatively rather than unilaterally, creating mechanisms for international consultation and coordination that had been absent during the interwar period. The system also embodied the economic philosophy that would dominate post-war Western policy, a commitment to free trade and currency convertibility, combined with recognition that governments had legitimate roles in managing their domestic economies to maintain full employment and social stability. Perhaps most importantly, Bretton Woods created permanent international institutions with significant financial resources and technical expertise. Unlike the ad hoc conferences and temporary arrangements that had characterized previous attempts at international economic cooperation, the IMF and World Bank were designed as ongoing institutions capable of adapting to changing circumstances. The implementation of the Bretton Woods system faced immediate challenges in the post-war world. Europe's economies were devastated by the war, creating enormous demands for reconstruction financing that exceeded the resources initially available through the new institutions. The dollar shortage of the late 1940s forced the United States to provide additional assistance through programs like the Marshall Plan. Currency convertibility, one of the system's central goals, proved impossible to achieve immediately. Most European countries maintained exchange controls and trade restrictions well into the 1950s, while the full convertibility envisioned at Bretton Woods was not achieved until 1958. These delays reflected the enormous practical challenges of reconstructing the global economy after the most destructive war in human history. Despite these initial difficulties, the Bretton Woods system provided a framework for the remarkable economic growth and expansion of international trade that characterized the 1950s and 1960s. Global trade volumes expanded rapidly, living standards rose dramatically in developed countries, and the system of fixed exchange rates provided the stability that facilitated long-term economic planning and investment. The system's success, however, contained the seeds of its eventual breakdown. As the global economy recovered and expanded, the dollar's role as both a national currency and the primary international reserve currency created what economist Robert Triffin identified as a fundamental contradiction. The Triffin dilemma pointed out that the world's need for dollar reserves would grow over time, requiring the United States to run persistent balance of payments deficits to supply these reserves. However, large and persistent deficits would eventually undermine confidence in the dollar's convertibility to gold, threatening the stability of the entire system. This contradiction became increasingly problematic during the 1960s as U.S. spending on the Vietnam War and domestic social programs created large fiscal deficits, while the country's trade position deteriorated relative to recovering European and Japanese economies. Foreign central banks accumulated growing quantities of dollars, raising questions about whether the United States could maintain gold convertibility if all these dollars were presented for conversion. The Bretton Woods system faced additional strains from changing economic conditions and evolving views about appropriate monetary policy. The rise of international capital movements, facilitated by improving communications and transportation, made it increasingly difficult to maintain fixed exchange rates in the face of speculative pressures. The system also struggled to accommodate different national priorities regarding inflation and unemployment. Countries with lower inflation rates found their currencies undervalued within the fixed exchange rate system, while countries with higher inflation faced pressures to devalue that conflicted with the system's emphasis on exchange rate stability. The end of the Bretton Woods system came dramatically on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at the fixed price of $35 per ounce. This Nixon shock effectively ended the gold-dollar standard and marked the beginning of the modern era of flexible exchange rates. The immediate cause of Nixon's decision was a run on U.S. gold reserves as foreign central banks, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, began converting large quantities of dollars to gold. Faced with the choice between defending gold convertibility through severe domestic deflation or abandoning the system, Nixon chose to preserve domestic policy autonomy. The collapse of Bretton Woods was followed by a period of monetary instability and experimentation. Attempts to maintain fixed exchange rates through the Smithsonian Agreement of 1971 and other arrangements proved unsuccessful, and by 1973, most major currencies were floating freely against each other. Despite the system's eventual breakdown, the Bretton Woods institutions proved remarkably adaptable and resilient. The IMF evolved from an institution focused on maintaining fixed exchange rates to one that provides financial assistance and policy advice to countries facing various economic difficulties. The World Bank expanded its mission from post-war reconstruction to global development and poverty reduction. The legacy of Bretton Woods extends far beyond the specific monetary arrangements that were abandoned in the early 1970s. The conference established the principle that international economic cooperation requires permanent institutions with significant resources and technical expertise, a principle that continues to guide efforts at global economic governance. The Bretton Woods institutions also embodied a particular vision of economic development and international relations that emphasized market mechanisms, private enterprise, and integration into the global economy. This Washington Consensus approach has been both influential and controversial, shaping development policies around the world while also generating criticism from those who advocate alternative approaches to economic development. Perhaps most importantly, Bretton Woods demonstrated that international economic cooperation is both possible and necessary for global prosperity. The conference showed that nations could overcome their immediate competitive interests to create institutions and rules that serve broader collective interests, even when this requires some sacrifice of national sovereignty. The challenges that led to the Bretton Woods Conference, financial instability, competitive nationalism, and the breakdown of international cooperation, remain relevant today. Contemporary issues such as global financial crises, trade wars, and currency manipulation echo the problems that Bretton Woods was designed to address. Modern international economic institutions, from the G7 and G20 to regional development banks and trade agreements, reflect the Bretton Woods legacy of institutionalized cooperation, even as they adapt to changed circumstances and new challenges. The conference also established important precedents for how international economic negotiations should be conducted. The combination of technical expertise, political leadership, and sustained negotiation that characterized Bretton Woods became a model for subsequent efforts to create international economic agreements. As we face contemporary global challenges including climate change, digital currencies, growing inequality, and the economic disruptions of technological change, the Bretton Woods experience offers both inspiration and lessons. It demonstrates that ambitious international cooperation is possible when leaders recognize that shared prosperity requires shared institutions and rules. At the same time, the system's eventual breakdown reminds us that international economic arrangements must evolve with changing circumstances and that even well-designed institutions may need fundamental reform when underlying conditions change significantly. The Bretton Woods Conference represents one of the most successful attempts in human history to consciously design international economic institutions that serve collective rather than purely national interests. While the specific monetary system created in 1944 proved temporary, the institutions, principles, and precedents established at Bretton Woods continue to shape global economic relations today. The conference's legacy reminds us that economic systems are not natural phenomena but human creations that can be reformed and improved through careful thought, negotiation, and cooperation. As we continue to grapple with the challenges of managing an interconnected global economy, the vision and ambition of the Bretton Woods founders remain an inspiration for what international cooperation can achieve. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of the Bretton Woods Conference and its lasting impact on the global economy. Tomorrow, we'll be back with our Military History episode where we'll be examining D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy that opened the Second Front in Europe and marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's final defeat. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What aspects of international economic cooperation do you find most important? And how do you think the lessons of Bretton Woods apply to contemporary global challenges? Let us know in the comments section below. For our members, this Sunday we'll have a special roundup of economic developments from the past week with connections to the historical patterns of international cooperation we've been exploring in this series. Until next time, I'm your guide for History Explained, where we believe that understanding yesterday is the key to navigating tomorrow.